There is a road in East Hampton where one house just sold for $115 million. Walk to the back of that property, past the pool, past the dune, and stand where the lawn ends. Everything holding that house up arrived from 20 miles east, one grain at a time. And for 60 years, we have been quietly cutting that supply line. If you have never seen the Hamptons in February, you have never actually seen the Hamptons. In August, the beaches between Southampton and Amagansett look like the most confident real estate on earth. Wide, pale, endless. In February, in the week after a nor'easter, some of those same beaches narrow to a strip you could cross in 8 steps, and the ocean comes up and touches the toe of a dune that has a $30 million house sitting on top of it. The prices are not an exaggeration. The most expensive combined transaction on record here is Barry Rosenstein's purchase of 3 contiguous parcels on Further Lane in East Hampton in 2014. And for a single residential parcel, the record is the 2025 sale of 408 Further Lane to Len Blavatnik for $115 million. The Rosenstein deal, reported at around $147 million for 18 beachfront acres, was the most expensive home purchase in America at the time. In 2025, single-family homes in Bridgehampton and Sagaponack averaged around $9.5 million, and oceanfront sits in a tier of its own. But what makes these houses remarkable is not the price, it is what is underneath them. Because unlike a house on a granite cliff in Maine or a house on bedrock in Manhattan, a Hamptons oceanfront house is not standing on land in any permanent sense. It is standing on a temporary arrangement of sand, an arrangement that is fed by a conveyor belt running east to west along the South Fork. And that conveyor belt has been interrupted by rock, by steel, by concrete, and by decisions made 60 years ago by people who had no idea what they were doing. And here is the part almost nobody outside Suffolk County knows. There is a date in New York state law that quietly decides whether you are allowed to defend your own house from the Atlantic Ocean. If your house was finished on the wrong side of that date, you can own $100 million of oceanfront and still be legally forbidden from building the wall that would save it. I will get to that date. Keep it in the back of your mind, because everything in this story bends around it. To understand why the Hamptons are in trouble, you have to understand the shoreline itself. Because Long Island's South Fork is not really land, it is a leftover. It is the outwash of a glacier that stalled here and then melted, dumping sand and gravel and clay into a long ridge. The ocean has been rearranging that pile ever since. What holds the ocean beaches in place is not rock, it is supply. Waves in this part of the Atlantic tend to arrive at an angle, and that angle pushes sand along the shoreline in a steady, mostly westward drift. Bluffs erode in Montauk. That eroded material enters the surf. It travels west, grain by grain, and it becomes the beach in Amagansett, then the beach in Sagaponack, then Watermill, then Southampton, then Westhampton, and eventually Fire Island. Every wide beach you have ever walked on out there is a beach that received more sand than it lost that year. That is the whole mechanism. It is a river of sand, and everything downstream depends on everything upstream staying loose. Now, the ownership. This is where the Hamptons get genuinely strange compared to almost any coastline in America, because the legal architecture out here is older than the United States. The East Hampton Town trustees manage the town's beaches, waterways, and bottomlands under the Dongan Patent of 1686, a colonial-era grant, and their position has always been that the public's right to use the beach was bestowed by that patent. 340 years of custom written into paper older than the Constitution, which sounds unbreakable. It is not, and we will come back to that, because there is a stretch of beach out there where a town government was eventually held in contempt of court and fined roughly $250,000 over who was allowed to park on the sand. For most of its history, the South Fork was farms and fishing villages, and a scattering of summer cottages set well back from the water, because the people who lived here full-time had watched the ocean take things. Then came the post-war boom. Lots were carved along the dune line. Cottages became houses, houses became compounds. Almost none of it was sewered, because Suffolk County was rural and septic systems were the obvious answer, and that decision is still poisoning the bays today. Suffolk County remains roughly 74% unsewered, with about 360,000 homes relying on aging septic and cesspool technology. Hold that thought too. It matters more than it sounds like it should. And here's the thing that made all of it feel safe. The decades when this coastline was most heavily developed were, by the standards of the Atlantic, quiet ones. Nobody buying a dune lot in 1958 had a reason to believe the sand in front of them was on loan. It looked permanent because for a generation it behaved permanently. Then the federal government tried to help. In the 1960s, the Army Corps of Engineers began building groins at Westhampton, long rock fingers running perpendicular from the beach out into the surf, designed to trap sand and hold the beach in place in front of a stretch of barrier island that kept getting chewed up. 11 groins went in during 1966 and 4 more in 1970. And they worked. That is the tragedy of it. They worked exactly as designed. Sand piled up against the eastern side of every groin, and the beach in the groin field got wider and healthier and safer. But a groin does not create sand. It intercepts it. Everything that piles up on the east side of a groin is sand that never made it to the beach on the west side. The westerly drift filled the easterly groins, and a sand deficit developed in the gap between the end of the groin field and the jetty at Mauritius Inlet. Downstream, the beach began to starve, and a starving barrier island does not simply get narrower. It gets lower and thinner, and eventually the ocean stops going around it and starts going through it. In 1980, the barrier island breached. By the time the breach was closed in 1981, it had grown to 1,000 meters across and required nearly 1 million cubic meters of sand to fill. That should have been the warning. It was treated as a repair. 12 years later, the bill came due for real. A succession of nor'easters in 1992 and 1993 opened a breach more than 3,000 feet wide and around 20 feet deep, and more than 190 homes were lost. The ocean punched through the barrier island at Pikes Beach in Westhampton and washed out Dune Road. Houses were destroyed outright or left stranded on isolated islands of sand. There is an account from that era of a county planner flying over the coast in a helicopter, counting how many houses had gone into the sea, and watching a restaurant on Dune Road slide off the edge and a swimming pool go with it. Funding for the groin project was eventually pulled, the jetty building stopped, and that is when the lawsuits began, a chain of litigation that would ultimately redefine beach defense in the Hamptons as a federal responsibility, almost in perpetuity. Read that last part again because it is the hinge of this entire story. The homeowners sued, and they had a real case because the erosion that destroyed them was not purely natural, it was downdrift of a federal structure. The residents incorporated as a village, and legal action against federal, state, and local government led to a stipulated settlement that allowed the community to be rebuilt with improved public access and habitat protection attached. The barrier island was reconstructed, homes came back, property values came back, and a precedent was set that the public would be paying to hold this shoreline in place, on a schedule, forever. A place that had been the poster child for what could go wrong became held up as a model of coastal management. Depending on where you stand, that is either a rescue or a permanent subsidy with a very small number of beneficiaries. Both readings are defensible. Neither one puts a single grain of sand back. Now, the second front. If Westhampton was the ocean taking houses, Sagaponack was houses trying to buy an ocean off. By the early 2010s, oceanfront owners across Watermill, Bridgehampton, and Sagaponack were watching their dunes go. Superstorm Sandy accelerated it. And these owners did something that had almost no precedent at this scale in the Northeast. Rather than wait for Washington, they voted to tax themselves and buy a beach. Property owners from Watermill to Sagaponack voted in early 2013 to approve a roughly $26.5 million plan to rebuild their beaches, with 124 property owners in the erosion control districts casting ballots, and the vote was not lopsided. In the Bridgehampton district, it passed 43 to 25. In Sagaponack, 32 to 24. Around 150 oceanfront owners self-funded a $26 million project to rebuild 6 miles of beach in front of their homes. The Bridgehampton district's share alone worked out to roughly $11.7 million, averaging about $148,000 per resident, with an annual assessment over 10 years averaging around $14,650 per parcel, on top of the regular tax bill. The 2013 to 2014 project placed 2.5 million cubic yards of sand onto 5.6 miles of oceanfront, and by most measures, it succeeded. It was named one of the nation's best restored beaches, and roughly 5 years in, the project as a whole had statistically seen no net loss of the sand pumped ashore, though some stretches held it better than others, which sounds like the happy ending. It is not an ending at all. It is a subscription, because a decade later, the sand had thinned, and the same owners had to do the same thing again. About 120 oceanfront homeowners in Watermill, Bridgehampton, and Sagaponack agreed to spend more than $26 million a second time to widen nearly 6 miles of beach. The renourishment placed roughly 1.2 million cubic yards, working westward from Town Line Road to Flying Point Beach, with dredging running around the clock. Pumping finished on the afternoon of April 17, 2025. So think about what those owners actually bought. Not a beach, a 10-year lease on a beach with a renewal clause at a price that resets every cycle on a coastline where the underlying trend is going the wrong direction. One of the organizers said the second round would be an easier sell than the first because everyone had seen the first one work. That is true. It is also exactly how a subscription becomes permanent. Meanwhile, 20 miles east, Montauk was fighting a different war and losing it in public. Downtown Montauk was built on and around the primary dune, motels sitting essentially where the natural protective feature used to be. After Sandy, the Army Corps went in with an emergency fix. In 2015, the Downtown Montauk Emergency Stabilization Project placed 14,000 geotextile sandbags, each weighing 1.7 tons, along more than half a mile of compromised shoreline, then covered them with about 3 feet of sand at a cost of $8.9 million. Geotextile bags were chosen over rock specifically because East Hampton restricts hard structures in its coastal zone. That detail tells you everything. The bags were not chosen because they were better. They were chosen because rock was not allowed. Hundreds of surfers protested on the beach. The Surfrider Foundation argued that reflected wave energy off geotextile bags would quickly erode the public beach and pointed out that 3 well-known coastal geologists had all concluded that sand-filled geotextile bags behave like bulkheads and other hard structures in terms of their impact on the shoreline. The project went ahead anyway, and then the ocean did the thing everyone said it would do. The project earned the nickname Dirtbag Beach. The bags have eroded out over the years, and Suffolk County and the town of East Hampton have had to pay to rebury them every year. Under the agreement with the Army Corps and the state, the town and the county share that annual cost. An emergency measure from 2015 turned into a permanent line item. That is what temporary means on an eroding coast. And the winners keep arriving. After storms on December 18th, 2023 and January 9th, 10th, and 12th, 2024, East Hampton officials described the beach profile at Ditch Plains in Montauk as non-existent and scoured down to hardpan, and state lawmakers formally asked the governor for matching funds to restore it. Not narrowed. Gone, down to the hard layer beneath. The town also began weighing whether to ask the Ditch Plains community to form its own erosion control district, a special taxing district, the Sagaponack model, applied to a neighborhood that is not Sagaponack. Behind all of it now sits the largest coastal engineering commitment in the region's history. The Fire Island to Montauk Point project, known as FIMP, is a $1.7 billion plan to regularly bolster beaches along 80 miles of Long Island's southern coastline over the next 30 years, funded through the Superstorm Sandy federal aid package. Most of the sand in the Montauk portion goes below the waterline, rebuilding the underwater profile so waves break earlier and further out. 30 years, 80 miles, repeating, that is not a repair either. That is a life support contract with a defined end date and no plan for what happens after it. Now the date. Here is where the law quietly decides who gets to fight and who does not. New York regulates construction and armoring inside mapped coastal erosion hazard areas, and the entire framework turns on a term of art: existing structures. Under the state's Coastal Erosion Management Permit Program, erosion protection structures, groins, jetties, seawalls, revetments, bulkheads, breakwaters, and even artificial beach nourishment are specifically regulated, and existing structures are defined as those that were built or under a construction permit, as of the effective date of the local erosion hazard law, or the date the DEC assumed regulatory responsibility, or the effective date of a certified revised hazard area map, whichever came first. Your rights are not determined by whether your house exists and is in danger. They are determined by whether your house existed on a specific administrative date attached to your specific municipality. And in East Hampton, the local rules go further than the state floor. The town's Coastal Erosion Overlay District divides the shoreline into 4 zones, and construction of erosion control structures is generally prohibited in all zones, except Zone 4, where new erosion control structures may be installed only with a natural resources special permit. Limited emergency actions are allowed without that review, but look at what those emergency options actually are. Move the threatened structure landward, make structural repairs, or deposit sand in front of it. Move it back, patch it, or buy sand. The one thing you are not being handed is permission to build a wall. Then there is the renovation trap. A major addition is defined as a 25% or greater increase in the ground area coverage of a structure. Cross that threshold, and you are no longer quietly maintaining a grandfathered cottage from 1959. You are triggering review on a coastline where review does not tend to end with a permit to armor. Which produces one of the most counterintuitive facts about this entire market. The newer and more expensive the house, the weaker its legal position. A modest, shingled cottage that has been sitting on a dune since the Eisenhower administration may carry more protective rights than the 50,000 square foot glass and limestone replacement built on the same footprint in 2018. Which brings us back to the sand itself, and who owns it. Because if the ocean is coming in and the wall is not coming, the boundary between private property and public beach starts moving, and the Hamptons have already fought that war in court for well over a decade. Oceanfront owners on Nepegue argued that the trustees had conveyed roughly 4,000 feet of ocean beach to Arthur Benson in an 1882 deed, and that their own deeds therefore ran to the high tide line. In 2016, after a 5-day trial, the state Supreme Court sided with the town and the trustees, finding the plaintiffs had not proven ownership. Then it flipped. In February 2021, an appellate panel reversed much of that decision, ruling that the property owners landward of the 4,000-foot stretch known as Truck Beach do in fact own the beach, and that the reservation in the 1882 deed amounted to an easement for fishing and fishing-related purposes only, not authority for the town to issue permits letting the public drive and park there. And then it got genuinely extraordinary. A judge ordered more than 6,000 beach driving permits revoked and held East Hampton Town and its trustees in contempt for violating the 2021 decision, fining the town nearly $240,000, payable to 5 homeowners associations and 4 individuals. By March 2023, the court had again sided with the property owners, dismissing complaints brought by the town, the trustees, and a dozen fishermen. A colonial patent from 1686 versus a deed from 1882 versus a beach that is physically moving underneath both documents. That is the Hamptons in one sentence. Now add the slow poison nobody photographs. Those septic systems from the 1950s never went away, and their nitrogen ends up in the bays. Research documented 30 so-called dead zones in Long Island bays, ponds, and estuaries in 1 year, and 36 the next, driven by excess nitrogen and record-high water temperatures, with on-site septic systems identified as the largest source of nitrogen going from land to sea. Eelgrass and coastal marshes, the same marshes that buffer the shoreline against storm surge and erosion, are being suffocated by it. So the very systems installed to make development possible have been degrading the natural infrastructure that made the development survivable. In November 2024, Suffolk voters approved the Water Quality Restoration Act, projected to generate around $4 billion to modernize wastewater infrastructure and address pollution from roughly 380,000 septic systems, passing with about 72% of the vote. That is a genuine win. It is also a fix that will take decades to show up in a marsh, on a coast that is being asked to hold the line this winter. And then there is the lighthouse, which is the whole story compressed into one building. The Army Corps project to shore up the shoreline around Montauk Point Lighthouse was completed in 2023, and the man overseeing it said plainly that he believes nature will have the last word eventually, including on his own project, while also believing the engineering can hold it for another century. Both of those beliefs at once. That is the honest position, and almost nobody in the real estate conversation states it that clearly. So where does that leave an owner today? It leaves them with 3 doors, and none of them lock. Door 1, pay for sand, on a recurring assessment with no exit and a price that rises with dredging costs and fuel. Door 2, fight for armoring inside a legal framework built specifically to discourage it, in a town where the code prohibits it in most zones and where the state ties your rights to a date you had no control over. Door 3, retreat, move the house landward if the lot is deep enough, and on many of these parcels it is not. Meanwhile, the market has never been hotter at the top. Sales above $10 million climbed 43% year over year in the third quarter of 2025. Deals above $20 million rose 33%, and inventory above $10 million was the tightest in 3 years, with oceanfront the most supply-constrained of all. Scarcity is winning the argument against physics, for now, because scarcity is priced quarterly and physics is priced by the century. And here is the part that should sit with you. None of this was a mystery, not one piece of it. The groins that starved Westhampton did exactly what coastal engineers now teach undergraduates that groins do. The sandbags in Montauk did exactly what 3 separate coastal geologists said they would do before a single bag was filled. The septic systems did exactly what unsewered density does to a shallow aquifer and the bays it drains into. The dune line was built on because it was the best view, and the dune was the only thing protecting the view. Every single failure was predicted, in public, by named people, in advance. What makes the Hamptons different from almost anywhere else on this coast is only the number on the deed. Everywhere else, when you build in a place the ocean is coming for, you lose a house. Here, you lose $100 million of house, and you lose it while holding a document that says the beach in front of you belongs to a colonial patent, and a state regulation that says you may not defend it, and a tax assessment that says you owe another payment on sand that is already washed away. The homeowners blame the government for the groins that started it. The government points at houses built on the dune. The public points at the owners who tried to privatize the beach. The owners point at a public that will not let them protect it. And every one of those positions has real evidence behind it, and not one of them changes the direction of the drift. So here is what I want you to think about. The sand program in Sagaponack has now been renewed once. What happens on the 3rd renewal, when the assessment is larger, the dredging is more expensive, and some of the owners who voted yes in 2013 have sold and moved on? What happens in Montauk when the FIMP money is spent and the 30 years are up? And what happens the first winter a big storm arrives right after a nourishment cycle instead of right before one? Nobody actually knows. What we do know is that the most expensive residential coastline in the Northeast is currently being held in place by a rented beach, a bag wall that has to be reburied every year, and a federal contract with an expiration date. So tell me what you think should happen here. Should owners be allowed to armor their properties however it takes, even if the public beach in front of them disappears as a result? Should the public keep funding a shoreline where the primary beneficiaries are the most expensive homes in the state? Or did everyone here, the buyers, the agencies, the engineers, get exactly the coastline they built for? Let me know in the comments.